Now, here are Morgan Streetman and Roxanne Wilder.
Well, here we all are. I've never looked forward to coming to work so much. Do y'all feel that way?
No.
Wow, this is a real change. It's a change from my home and just staring at the same setting I've been in for I don't know how long. How about you?
Right about that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I tell you what, I mean, it's getting old already. And we've only been doing it about 2 weeks.
3.
Has it been a full 3 weeks for us? I think it's only been 2 weeks.
I think it started in half of 1 week and then
Started
it's
on a
about
Friday.
3, Wednesday, yeah. So
Yeah.
might be 3. But it seems like
If
30.
you try to say, hey, remember when we talked about XYZ last week? You have no frame of reference. Like our time is so screwy right now because one day it's Groundhog's Day.
Well, and it does seem like the coronavirus is all anyone can talk or think about, and it kind of causes you to lose a bit of connection to the passing of time, because there's just nothing else that anybody's focused on. And we're even kind of hearing some of the same stories retread over and over again, some that we were even on early.
That's right. Dr. Fauci and his ties to different people, you talked about that weeks ago before it became a little bit more mainstream news. But the other thing, too, I notice is Sunday, I sit down, I do a lot of web posts for the week on Q105.
Yeah.
And we try to keep things just informative, not political. All of the stories have a political angle to them now.
Yeah. Well, this coronavirus, COVID-19 thing, I hate that name, by the way. I absolutely hate the name COVID-19. I'm not sure why. I just don't like it.
Let's hope there's not a 20.
Yeah, well, I mean, is that what are we going to have this from now on? I guess we are. There'll be a COVID version 20 that comes later this year, since COVID-19 refers to it starting last year.
And they're already talking about disrupting the election.
Well, disrupting
if it comes back.
I mean, who even cares about the election if we don't get the country back to work? I mean, I have to tell you, I don't know how we're going to survive this. The things that I'm reading in a lot of the mainstream news talks about, things are going to come back, but they're going to come back to like an 80% level. Well, I'm sorry, but if we only come back to an 80% level, we are in deep, deep trouble. That is as bad or worse than the Great Depression, essentially, right there. And it's going to be like a semi-permanent change. I mean, we've got so many changes. It's amazing to me how quickly things have changed in our society.
I'll counter you with one positive economic upbeat note here. My mom was talking about how she can't wait to get out and spend her money because she's been saving so much money. So you have a lot of these boomers who really have, that you have a fixed income. You've been piling it away, stockpiling it as you continue to enjoy retirement.
Yeah.
And now you're ready to go out, run out the gates to go spend it once it starts back up again.
Well, but the question is what's going to start back up? What's she going to be able to spend it on, right?
And how far will your dollar go?
Good call. Exactly. What's the dollar going to be worth with all of this additional inputs that they've been putting into the system where they're just giving money away to people? It's amazing to me that is the concept of how we get through this, is we switch from a consumption and production-based economy to simply giving money away to people for nothing. I mean, think about the inefficiencies of that. But I also, to me, it's very interesting to me how much in just a little over a month, and we've only been really upset about this coronavirus thing as a nation for a little more than a month. It's been about a month since things kind of went off the rails. I think if you look back at some of the stories in early March, you'll see, I mean, there was still, everything seemed to be pretty normal. I think the president was even talking about, everything was going to stay pretty normal. It seemed like, okay, well, yeah, maybe it's going to get bad in some areas, maybe California, maybe Washington, maybe New York, places like that. But overall, we're going to be able to continue with some degree of normalcy. And then it just very quickly seemed to go downhill where all of these shelter-in-place orders started getting issued everywhere.
Yeah, I thought we'd get about a half a dozen, maybe a dozen here in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
Nothing like it is.
Yeah. You mean cases?
Right.
Yeah. Right. I mean, well, and I don't know that there's all that many cases just by pure volume here in the Bay Area or even in Florida. I mean, there are obviously thousands, but, how many people live in Florida? 20-something million, right? So we're talking about a relatively small part of the population has probably got this. Of course, there's some question about whether we even know who all has it because we don't have universal testing. And I'm not advocating necessarily for universal testing. But if we had universal testing, at least we would then have an idea maybe of who all has it, because maybe there are all these asymptomatic carriers that they've talked about, how you can have the virus and not even know you have it and be spreading it to others. I think there's so much we don't know about this. I don't even know if that's true.
Mm-hmm. What I have heard as far as statistics on numbers of Floridians who have been tested, 1 in 125. And we can expect to see that number increase.
Well, and so as that number, I mean, that's, so less than 1% is another way of putting that, 1 in 125, significantly less than 1% have been tested. So, it's much less than giving us a true sense of how many people might have this who are asymptomatic. Because obviously, if you don't have symptoms, you're not going to go get tested. I mean, who's going to put up with that? I don't even know if they'll give you the tests. I haven't investigated exactly what the situation is now. My understanding is you still have to be recommended by your doctor to get the test. In other words, you have to call your doctor and tell your doctor, hey, I'm showing some symptoms and things like that.
Tampa General has rolled out a new way that you can be tested. If you download their app, you can talk 24 hours with the physician. They'll screen you via the app by asking you questions, determine if you need to get tested. And they also have a hotline you can call. There are 2 physical locations you can go to 7 days a week.
Yeah. But we're far from the situation, well, I don't know if we're far from it, but we don't have the situation of on-demand testing where you could just go in and say, hey, I just want to be checked here. And, of course, this is testing you. What we're talking about is testing you for an active case of the virus in your system. We haven't really gotten to the point yet, but it's coming very soon where they can test you for antibodies. So that would be after your body's already defeated the virus and now knows how to produce its defenses, its defensive system, the antibodies to this virus, and they're in your system. Your body knows how to fight the virus. Once that happens, you can get an antibody test to find out if you've got it, but you probably still are not going to test positive at that point on a test designed to see if you have the active virus in your system. Although we're getting conflicting reports, and I'll tell you, that's one of the big aspects of this coronavirus story that I think is sort of being overlooked by people. Not everyone. Some people are on to this thought process. But it's just how much we don't know about this. Still to this day, I mean, you think, oh, we have to know everything about something as soon as it comes out. And we've got all these people that have written all these things about the virus, and so many scientists have weighed in and so on and so forth. But the truth is there's a lot we don't know. And it's interesting because the scientists like the Dr. Fauci's and Dr. Birx, and we're just picking on them because they're 2 of the names that we know because they're on TV, they're part of the task force, et cetera. And they're out there in the media doing a lot of talking about this. But the same degree of scrutiny that some of them want to apply to some of the treatments, for example. So we've got all this evidence. Now, it may not be double-blind placebo studies done on this hydroxychloroquine stuff, which they say if you mix that with a Z-Pak, that's a pretty good treatment. Now, we don't know that. I mean, we're not doctors. We've talked about this. We talked about this last week. We've talked about this a bunch on the show just because it's fascinating to me to watch how cautious they are about talking about that particular treatment. It's like, oh, you can't even mention it. It's reckless.
And why?
It's reckless, Pat George. That's why it's reckless. But meanwhile, we're going to talk about models with bad assumptions and data that we don't even understand about a virus. We still don't even have a real understanding of what this virus is and what it does. And we're going to talk about it as though we do. We're going to say if you do 100% mitigation, and we're just going back just 2 weeks, if you do 100% mitigation in this country, you'll wind up with, at a minimum, 100,000 deaths. As though that's some kind of scientific fact. As though it's a math problem. And they've already figured it out. That's a minimum. That's if you do 100% mitigation. Now, if we sort of slip up from place to place, as it appears, as they would say on the TV, as it appears that Americans are doing, then we could have up to 240,000 deaths. And that sounds like fact. You think that's going to happen? You go back 2 weeks from that, 2 weeks. So now we're 4 weeks from today, back in time. And they're talking about between 1 million and 2.1 million deaths across the entire United States. They've since revised the counts down from 100,000 at the lowest to 80,000 to now I've heard 60,000 is the latest number that they're coming up with in their models. And I'm just scratching my head and I'm going, how can you believe anything that these people tell you? Because they say it as though they have some degree of certainty about it. And obviously they don't. They don't know anything about this. And that goes for the treatment, too. So how come we're not even allowed to talk about the treatment or we're being reckless? How come we're not even allowed to reference it? That doesn't make any sense to me at all. We're going to tell you some more about this when we come back.
A lot of people, when you're talking about coronavirus, COVID-19, you're wondering, okay, what happens when you actually get it? What do you feel like? It makes everybody nervous because you say, hey, I have this cough. How will I know if I need to go to the doctor? Morgan Streetman, what have you found out?
Well, we've got some interesting things to share with you. One of them is a story from a neurologist who got this coronavirus and what happened to him. His name is Dr. Andrew Faskowitz, and you can go out there and find the story that he tells. Obviously, we won't be able to tell you the entire thing, but he says it was a very scary situation for him overall, that he had about 17 days of very mild symptoms, and then it was followed up by all of a sudden he lost all sense of smell and taste. And he says that that was probably due to the introduction of the virus into his brain, traversing the cribriform plate via his olfactory bulb. Now, remember, this guy's a neurologist, so he's trying to actually get into the science. But the point is, you could have this virus for several weeks, 2 weeks, for example, and then all of a sudden it can get into a part of your body where things kind of go off the rails and it really gets out of control. He then also had what he calls a syncopal episode. I don't even know what that is, but I know what the following thing is. He says, followed up by bizarre, frightening, well-formed visual hallucinations. And I thought this was so interesting, connected with what we were talking about last week about the hallucinations that apparently can come with this virus. And he said his fiance, in his mind at least, turned into a monster. And he thinks this is evidence of the virus getting into his reticular activating system, or RAS. It's part of the brain that's close to the top of the spinal column and extends upward about 2 inches, he says. It's got a diameter slightly larger than your little finger or a pencil, essentially. If anyone still remembers what a pencil is, do we still even use pencils? I haven't seen a pencil in ages. But in any event, so the virus is circulating throughout his body for more than 2 weeks, and then it goes through his nose, essentially into his brain, and it causes him to begin to lose his sense of taste, his sense of smell. And then a couple of days after that, he started developing auditory hallucinations. So he was hearing things, and then he was not able to sleep at all. And then he started on a very steep downward progress to where he was very, very ill, and he almost died. Now, he gets to the point where he says basically his primitive respiratory center, that thing in the brain that's always on that causes you to breathe, for example, at night when you're not thinking, okay, breathe, breathe, breathe. Well, your brain is still in there working, and it's sending electrical signals to your lungs that are essentially doing the same thing, telling them breathe, 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 so you don't die at night when you're sleeping because you're not conscious, right? It's subconscious. It's a fundamental thing that our body does. Well, it's not happening just because. It's actually happening based on impulses coming out of the brain. So if somehow those impulses get turned off, there's no reason particularly that you would breathe at night otherwise. So it's not just, you have to understand that the brain is still active in this whole process.
Is that why the ventilator?
Well, that could be part of the reason, and we've got another story that we want to get into to tell you a little bit more about what might be happening and why maybe the ventilators aren't the answer. But we have heard about people who are not able to breathe without some kind of voluntary thought process. So it switches from being a subconscious activity to actually needing to be a conscious activity. They're having to force themselves to breathe, and this seems to be the story that this guy is telling. He says basically after several days in intensive care, he voluntarily stopped breathing. In other words, he stopped telling himself, okay, you got to breathe in, Dr. Faskowitz, you got to breathe in, you got to keep breathing. He stopped doing that, and he lost consciousness, and he said he was ready to embrace death with open arms. So I guess he had just been worn down by the process, and he was just like, well, I guess I'm going to die, and I'm just going to be okay with that. And apparently the nurse rushed in, was able to rouse him from this unconsciousness that he had fallen into, and got him connected to oxygen. Now, what's interesting is the story that he then tells is that evening he started this hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, and he said he was able to sleep about 1 hour, and it looks like that's the first hour he'd slept in several days, according to what his story is. And the next morning he woke up, and he said 99% of his neurologic symptoms had resolved.
Bingo.
Now, he's board certified, lest you think this is just some hack or somebody who's not a real doctor in some fashion. And we've heard all of those kind of things thrown around depending on what opinions you might share with people that you get off the internet. And we've heard people saying, oh, that guy's not the right kind of doctor or whatever. Well, okay, but, still, what about, forget about the appeal to the authority of who said it. What about what they're saying? Could what they're saying be right? Forget about the messenger, in other words. Everybody wants to make it about the messenger. But what about the message? What about the idea that this hydroxychloroquine could be helping people? But now this guy is board certified in neurology, Dr. Andrew Faskowitz, and he's saying basically the night that he started getting hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, the Z-Pack, the night he started getting those is the night he made a big turnaround. And earlier that day, he'd been ready to give up and basically, essentially released himself to die. I wouldn't say he was trying to die, but he just sort of gave up. And he released himself, and had the nurse not rushed in and put him on the oxygen, he wouldn't have made it. Now, I'm curious to know what happened to Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, because, he had kind of a similar story, not exactly the same, but kind of similar. He had about 10 days of symptoms where he was self-quarantining, self-isolating, and his main symptom apparently was a fever because he was still holding meetings with his cabinet and trying to run the government during that time. But then something changed, and this was, I guess, a week ago yesterday. Something changed with him, and he suddenly had to go to the hospital. He checks into the hospital and then very quickly checks into the ICU, the intensive care unit, and he was in big trouble. Now, he just got out, I think it was Saturday from that. He just got, or Friday night. Anyway, it was this weekend that he just got out of the hospital. He was fully released, and he went Saturday midday to his office to record a message to the British people, to England, the nation that he's the head of. And in the message, he says there's no question that he almost died and that the National Health Service, the NHS, saved his life. And he goes on it's a very touching message where he talks about the nurses and what they were doing for him, although not in any medical detail like we're kind of talking about. But he makes it clear that in his opinion, he almost died. And also he says that he was on oxygen.
Not a ventilator.
Not a ventilator, but oxygen. So he wasn't intubated, and he didn't get put on a ventilator, but he was given oxygen, and he credits the nurse kind of standing there and adjusting his oxygen levels all night with being what saved him. I'm curious to know personally if he got anything else, if maybe they gave him that hydroxychloroquine. I mean, one just wonders. Of course, that's not mentioned anywhere in the story, but what was the reason for his turnaround when so many stories we've heard about people when they get into a bad situation, whether it's from the get-go or whether it's a couple of weeks after getting the first symptoms, the kind of mild symptoms, but when they get into a bad situation, we've heard so many stories, and the media has just been sort of trumpeting these stories from the rooftops about how people go downhill and end up dying, and they die on the ventilator or die in the ICU.
There are some other patients that doctors have given the hydrochloroquine and zinc. 8, 10, 12 hours later, they're in the hospital. They're ready to walk out of the hospital.
Well, we just hear that. I mean, that's what I'm saying. I mean, okay, I get the idea that, you hear a story here and there and it's anecdotal evidence, but we've just heard story after story of people in that same kind of situation. Thinking back to Daniel Day Kim, who was one of the early celebrities to get it, And he credits hydroxychloroquine with being what turned around his situation, and he got to feeling better very quickly. I mean, over and over again, we hear that particular treatment has a pretty fast effect. So,
Do you have any of that now?
Huh?
Do you have any hydrochloroquine on you?
I don't have any on me. No, Pat George.
We talked about it earlier. Two of my friends posted images that they are holding it just in case.
Yeah.
And then other friends will post and say, you shouldn't talk about this. This is irresponsible to talk about.
It's reckless.
So why has it become a almost political point?
Well, why can't we talk? I mean, can you imagine if somebody was, back during flu season, Pat George, if you were like, you know what, you should get some lemons and squeeze the lemons and put it with some water and some honey and make you some honey lemon water because that's real good for your immune system. And somebody was like, you stop that, Pat George. You are reckless.
Zinc lozenges.
There you go again, you reckless man. There has been no double-blind controlled study to prove the effectiveness of zinc lozenges or honey lemon water or bed rest or anything else. You're just talking out of school, and you're going to be you're going to have blood on your hands, Pat George. For talking like that, you are going to have blood on your hands from the people who try it, and then what happens? Oh, it doesn't work. Oh, big deal, right? So, I mean, what's the deal? You're right, Roxanne, it's been totally politicized. The reason they don't want hydroxychloroquine to work is because President Trump is really the first one who started talking about it. And more than anything, more than stopping deaths, they want President Trump to fail.
And we're back on the Morgan Streetman Show. Morgan sounds like a doctor as well as an attorney today when you're digging into all of this very detailed information related to what the coronavirus does to you or can do to you. This is one doctor's story who describes in detail what he went through.
Yeah, that was a very interesting story by that Dr. Andrew Faskowitz, board certified in neurology, subspecialty certified in pain management and hospice and palliative medicine. That's medicine for people who are about to die, palliative care. Now, so he tells his story about what happened when he got it, and it's very interesting. It lines up with some of the other things that we've heard. Interesting that it has a long period kind of where you just have mild symptoms, and then things went downhill for him really quickly as the virus began to invade other parts of his body, particularly his brain. And then, of course, everything turned around when he got on a Z-Pack and hydroxychloroquine, which you're not allowed to talk about, apparently. I've noticed by the way, on YouTube, I've noticed the videos where we talk about hydroxychloroquine are getting like no views. And I don't think they're getting no views. I think YouTube, because I've actually seen it where I've gone in and I've seen the view count going down. So the view count might say, 25 views or something, and then you click on the video itself and it'll say like 9 views. So you can actually see them taking away views from the view count because you're not allowed to talk about this. They don't want people to know about it. And none of us sitting here, we're just normal people. Like you said, we're not doctors. None of us can figure out why don't they want anybody talking about this. I mean, it seems to help people. Well, another doctor, and this is one you really ought to go out there and watch the video. This is really interesting stuff from an ICU doctor in New York City. And he's really questioning how the COVID-19, which I said I hate it and there I'm using it, but the coronavirus actually works in the body because he says he's seeing patients who have something a lot closer to altitude sickness than pneumonia. Now, his name is Dr. Cameron Kyle Siddell, and he's got a couple of videos out on YouTube that you may want to check out. But he basically talks about the way that he's coming to understand that the coronavirus may operate and what may actually be happening to patients. Now, as we all know, the coronavirus creates some kind of a situation in your body where you're not getting enough oxygen to your organs and your systems in your body. And that's a lot of what's causing people to die is the lack of oxygen. Now, we have long thought that was because there was some kind of infection going on from the coronavirus in your lungs themselves, in the alveoli sacs in your lungs, and it was creating some kind of fluid discharge that was essentially causing your lungs to fill up with fluid, and then you were drowning. That's what pneumonia is, right? That's pneumonia described. Your lungs fill up with fluid, and you can't get enough volume of air into your lungs to get the oxygen that you need because, say, half or more of your lungs are filled up with water. So you just have this big portion of your lungs that aren't even functioning. And that's a lot of what we thought the coronavirus was probably doing. But it's so interesting because it just goes to show you how little we understand about the mode of action of this. Well, this particular New York City MD who's working in the ICUs is saying that he actually doesn't see the lungs filling up with fluid, and it's not really pneumonia, that it's still an oxygen deprivation situation, but it's instead coming from a different place. And what he's suggesting is that the coronavirus is actually affecting the way that your blood works. Now, your blood has hemoglobin in it. You probably heard the word hemoglobin. That's a big component of your blood. It's got a lot of other things. The blood has a lot of stuff in it. It's primarily water. But the red blood cells, the active part of the blood, at least when we're talking about the movement of oxygen around your body, is the hemoglobin. Now, the hemoglobin works, and I'll try to just keep this simple, and I'm not going to pretend that I have a doctor-level understanding of this, but I've read his descriptions and listened to his videos, and I can kind of explain it to you. The hemoglobin basically works by capturing some of the oxygen molecules from the air. This happens in your lungs, and they attach, and it's basically due to electrical charges. We're talking about electrons, and free radicals, essentially, that are part of the hemoglobin molecule that capture an oxygen, and then it moves it from place to place around your body. Now, what this doctor from New York City says is that the SARS coronavirus, CoV-2, actually attaches to the hemoglobin where the oxygen normally would attach, and there's apparently per each cell, there's 4 attachment points, and so it will attach to all of those points. Now, as part of doing this, it also releases that free radical that's bound up in that molecule, in that cell, and releases that free radical, which is a free radical of iron, and it releases that into the bloodstream then. And so what you have is you now have a receptor that no longer operates. It can't capture the oxygen anymore because it's got the coronavirus attached to it, and it's also lost its negative charge that it had from the iron. Okay, from the iron-free radical that's now floating around in your blood. And he says that this is really the problem. So the coronavirus is really attacking the blood itself, and it's attacking it by tying it up and covering up the receptor sites that normally would carry oxygen. Now, here's the other side effect that then has. Apparently, those iron-free radicals are collecting in the lungs. And he says that's actually what's showing up on the imaging scans that show what we've referred to and what is being called largely the ground glass opacity, or it basically looks like your lungs are full. They're full of something that appears to be all white on the scan, the imaging scan. And again, we've discussed this ground glass opacity. This is one of the components that you see in a lot of these coronavirus cases when people do get very sick. But the point is, if you have this situation, can you imagine how a ventilator is not really going to help you? Because your problem isn't really, you're not getting enough volume of air into your lungs, and so there's not enough oxygen molecules in the lungs in that volume of air to be pulled out by the hemoglobin. The problem is that the hemoglobin's not working anymore. It's no longer grabbing a hold of oxygen out of the air, no matter how much you breathe. So put somebody on a ventilator, and it's probably not even going to matter. Right? If this is the case, if this is the way the virus attacks the body, you put somebody on a ventilator, and it's not the volume of air that's the problem. It's the fact that the transfer mechanism and the carrier for the oxygen doesn't function anymore because it's been occupied. Now, I just think that's very interesting. We don't know, obviously, what the truth is, but, after, I'm sure, a couple of years of study, we'll come to understand this particular virus better. There is some truth out there somewhere about this, but it's hard for me to understand. Now, switching back to just thinking about this big picture as a layperson, it's hard for me to understand why, knowing so little about it, you've got people like Dr. Fauci who are so certain that you can't talk about hydroxychloroquine, and I've heard so many negative things about the French study that was done on it and other studies that have been done on it. My suggestion is, look, it seems to have worked for some people, including this neurologist doctor we talked about, including Daniel Day Kim. One wonders if Boris Johnson may have gotten it. I mean, certainly if they knew about it, you'd think they would have given it to him, because at one point he was about to die from the coronavirus. So with so much that we don't know about how it works and why it works, and you might even say, well, how does that, I don't understand, how does hydroxychloroquine have an effect? Because, malaria is not a virus, right? So it's not an antiviral. Malaria is not a virus. Malaria is a blood parasite. Well, interestingly, the malaria parasite, it's a protozoa. It's like a little creature that gets in your body and attacks you. A parasite, lives off of you, attacks the hemoglobin. It's a blood parasite. So that's the mode of action of malaria. Now, isn't it interesting if we then think about this possible mode of action of the coronavirus, which also attacks the hemoglobin, albeit in a different way, but it's still attacking the same, molecule in your blood, and it attacks that, and somehow this treatment works for both. Now, I don't know the exact way, the mode of action, the mechanism of the hydroxychloroquine treatment, but I think it's interesting if you've got two things that attack the blood and the treatment seems to work for both. Well, maybe there's a connection there, and maybe it really works. I have to say, what's the harm in trying it? The major side effect, by the way, of hydroxychloroquine that I've seen, the most common side effect, is hallucinations. So if you're getting
that's rare.
And it's rare, right?
But also, you're going to have hallucinations if you have a high fever.
You're going to have hallucinations with a high fever. You're going to have hallucinations with coronavirus. You already got the hallucinations, right? So who cares?
I just typed in hydroxychloroquine and zinc in Twitter.
Yeah.
And I rolled it 3 times. There wasn't one negative. All it is it works. It works. 9 out of 10, 7 out of 8, 350 patients recovered, 8 to 12 hours, you feel better.
So what's the
not a negative?
Yeah. So what could possibly be the mentality of people like Dr. Fauci who don't want us to talk about this, who've poo-pooed this possible treatment?
Pharmaceutical companies that are going to make a lot of money on a vaccine?
A lot of money on a vaccine is for sure. And, there's so many different things we could talk about. I don't want to not mention something because there are other possible treatments out there. And just last week, the FDA moved into clinical trials a treatment from an Israeli company called Pluristem that's some kind of, and this is one I do not have a good understanding of, but I could tell you a little bit about it. It's some kind of placenta-based cell therapy. So I guess they're getting it from the placentas of babies.
Saved mine. I knew I should have saved mine.
It would be like gold, Roxanne. You could. Anyway, what the promising thing about this, now here again, this hasn't been through clinical trials, but the promising thing about this particular treatment is so far 100% survival rate with this new treatment that the FDA has moved into clinical trials. So there are hopeful things coming from a bunch of different corridors, including treatments other than hydroxychloroquine. But, we've had so many effects on our economy coming from this coronavirus, and I'm telling you, we have got to get this economy started again. This coming back to an 80% level is just simply not going to work for us. And I hear we have a caller now. That's wonderful. Before we get the caller on, I was just going to say, I don't know if you heard, but last week, about 7% of all U.S. milk production got dumped down the drain. They just poured it out. And you can see
That's
the videos.
crazy.
Isn't that crazy? We've got people standing in line all across the country waiting for food. We've got mile-long food bank lines, and yet we've got farmers who've got to pour milk down the drain. What we'll do with a caller, and we had so many other things I wanted to talk about. We wanted to talk about churches and some of the things we've seen going on with churches, because it's amazing to me that you can go to Walmart and you can interact with people in Walmart, but you're not allowed to go to church. You can do certain things. Certain things are deemed essential. You could go to the liquor store. The ABCs are now the new hot place to
essential.
be.
Mm-hmm, it
The
is.
liquor is essential, but a little bit of message from God. No. Even if you're staying in your car, like they did in Greenville, Mississippi, they were giving people $500 tickets in Greenville, Mississippi, which is already a very economically underdeveloped town. It's not a rich place. $500 tickets, a lot of money for trying to go to Good Friday services. And these were services where they were going to stay in their cars. So we'll take the caller when we come back, and then we'll go out there.
Real quick, before we go back, we got a problem on I-4 westbound right at Thenona-Sassa Road, an accident. Wow, how about that? Our first accident of the morning, blocking the left-hand lanes, and we do have a delay. Westbound I-4 at the Nona Sassa.
And we're back on the Morgan Streetman Show, getting ready to go out there, but we want to say hello to a caller real quick. Byron.
Hey, Byron.
Hey, Morgan. Thanks for the education and amazing information. This has been wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you. What thoughts have you had about this matter in the last week or so?
Well, being in the sector of real estate as my main source of employment, I got to say I was at a closing today, and it's strikingly odd that when you walk into any title company, they've got all the signs up, and there's just not a lot of movement. There's a lot of refis we hear, but as far as purchases and sales, not so much. And the other thing is Keynesian economics, man, and my understanding of just basic fundamentals, if it's not moving, the almighty dollar, then the system's not going to work. The theory itself is not going to work. So drive on the road, no cars. It's not moving. The economy is not moving. We're at a standstill.
And, I mean, can you imagine? I mean, they're saying we cannot even reopen by the end of this month. That would be reckless. We need to stay closed through at least the beginning of June. I mean, what in the world is going to happen to people if we have to stay closed another month and a half?
There's always the side effect that always comes later, just like the medicine they're preaching to tell us, when there's dormancy, then there's a bunch of expenditures. It's the dollar that's next. I think it's just going to take a few more years.
Yeah.
After this, they're just going to hyperinflation after stagnation. I don't know. It's pretty bad.
Well, and you've seen just a dramatic expansion of the debt in the last 20 years or so. I mean, we've talked on the show before about, what was going on back in the mid-'90s. And remember, we got to a balanced budget, and I think the federal debt, which is different than the deficit would be zero if we balanced the budget, but the debt back then was something like $4 trillion. Well, we're over $20 trillion already, where I think we're between 21 and 23 trillion somewhere. I don't have the exact number.
We were at 23 last week when your show aired. We're at 24 trillion this week. It is at 24 trillion. Yeah.
So that's 6 times what we were at about 20 years ago in terms of our debt load. And they're just going to have to put the pedal to the metal here because they're going to have to start sending. Well, I say they're going to have to. They really don't have to, but this is what I think they're going to do. Just sending checks to everybody. All of a sudden,
I can't believe the checks. I cannot believe the whole check mentality. You're going to get your check. I think as soon as those checks don't come to fruition, or they're not enough because of the amount of time that the economy shut down, people are going to have social unrest.
You better believe it.
Yep.
And all these people that live paycheck to paycheck and now no longer get a paycheck, 17 million of them as of the end of last week have applied for unemployment. Now, that's about 1 out of every 10 people that was even working in this country. Now, what in the world is going to happen?
Go up. Crime's already going up. Just locally, if you touch base with your local police department and you get your report of your zip code, it's already starting to pile up.
Yeah. Well, and we're going to see more and more of that. And then on the one hand, we've got, bread lines, or we've got, food pantry lines. And on the other hand, we've got producers of milk dumping, milk down the drain, not quite 10%, but say 10% of the milk production in this entire country last week just got dumped down the drain. We've got Smith.
All our produce.
Smith.
All of our produce.
Yeah.
Produce. In 1989,
That's sad.
the ruble was worth way more. I tell people all the time, look at the ruble in 85 leading up to 89 when the wall came down.
Yeah.
And then you saw people in bread lines and milk lines and food lines, and the ruble just collapsed. Why would it not happen here? They were taken advantage by these monetary banksters.
Right. Well, Byron, thank you for the call.
Thank you.
Yeah, really appreciate your input, and thanks for listening.
Just during that call, you went $4 million in debt. Just during that call.
It's unbelievable.
Stresses me out just thinking about it.
It's unbelievable. I mean, if any of us lived like this, I know a lot of people live paycheck to paycheck, But if we live the way the federal government is living, I mean, it just wouldn't be possible.
Politicians just view it as a kicking the can down the road.
Kick the can down the road. Don't make any hard decisions. You know, as long as I get mine today, who cares about our grandchildren? But something's got to change here. And the level at which they are adding to the debt now with all of these spending programs, we're going to, $300 billion here, $600 billion there. I mean, this stuff really adds up fast, and we just put it on our tab. That's what the politicians just put it on our tab. We're good for it. We're gonna pay you. I mean, at some point, it's like, no, we're not going to extend you any more credit. And of course, it's a lot more complicated than that. We're just using an analogy, but to try to bring it to a level where people can explain it. But it's a lot more complicated because the way money is created in this country. But Byron brings up a really good point. The entire economic system of this country is designed around the velocity of money. This country works the way that it does with this huge debt load and all on credit. It only works because the money keeps moving, because there's commerce, there's production, there's economic activity. And that's why the most important thing to measure is the velocity of money. Go ahead.
Speaking of velocity of money, I hope that when things open up, and I'm just thinking about personal stuff like getting my hair done, different sorts of treatments you might want to get, I hope that those places are open from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. and they're doing a lot more, like with Amy, just doing a lot more jobs, long, hard days, but at least the velocity will be rocketing up.
Well, let's hope so, but I have this sinking feeling that we can't unplug, like I said, and then just plug back in a couple of months later and expect everything to just keep going, just to pick right back up. The music restarts right where we left off. I don't see how that happens ultimately. I mean, you're going to have some long-term damage. You have the closure of businesses. People are just going out of business. People are out of work. They're not going to get rehired. I mean, this is going to have long-term effects. Now, I know we got to be coming right up on the music. What do we got, 30 seconds? No, not even that.
15
to the music. Well, listen, I'm just going to mention this then. We had two out there's. One is this immunity card idea. We're not going to have time to cover that. We're not going to have time to really cover either of them. But I just want to mention this other one because this is the most explosive. This report came out. Did you know that they were studying the coronavirus, and in fact, a bunch of different coronaviruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology? In fact, they took bat samplings 10 times from April 2011 to October 2015 from Yunnan province in China, which is about 1,000 miles away. They captured bats in the caves and took samples from them. I won't tell you how they took the samples because it's kind of gross, but they took samples from them. They eventually produced a research paper called Discovery of a Rich Gene Pool of Bat SARS-related Coronaviruses Provides New Insight into the Origin of SARS Coronavirus. That was produced, that research paper, in November of 2017. And this all magically happened in Wuhan. But don't believe that for a second. This virus came out of that wet market. I'm Morgan Streetman, and that's the way I see it. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard. And if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.